Hi guys, we're going to talk a little bit about renewable energy sources. We're going to start off, I'm going to split this into two videos because I don't want you to have one big long 20-minute long one. So we're going to talk about solar first, and of course, as always, there are a couple of things you should be focusing on always is sustainability. Are these things sustainable? And the trade-offs. What makes these things desirable or undesirable in a given situation? So that's always what we want to look for. So we're going to dive into solar first. One of the general ideas behind sustainability is that all of our energy on Earth, essentially in one way or another, or most of it anyway, comes from the sun. That if we rely on energy from the sun, that essentially we're going to be a lot more sustainable for it, because the sun is essentially a sustainable resource. Yes, technically non-renewable in 5-10 billion years or whatever it's going to burn out. But for most of our purposes, I think that those billions of years will probably suffice as renewable. So the more we can focus on energy that derives directly and quickly from the sun in one way or another, the more sustainable we're going to be. Now, when we say that, obviously we're going to sort of think initially, well, if we're talking about the sun, right, then we're talking about solar. But that's not necessarily the only way. Wind energy actually comes from the sun, because remember, wind results from the uneven heating of the atmosphere. So you get high pressure systems and low pressure systems, and wind is going to go from high pressure to low pressure. That's the driving force behind wind. To get biomass to grow, to get plants and animals to grow, to provide us with biomass, that's going to require sunlight. That's sort of at the bottom of the food chain there. And even moving water to some degree is relying on the sun. Do the snow caps on the mountains get melted, and that drives the force of the river that we get the hydroelectric dams from? All of that is going to result from solar power, essentially in one way or another. So here's the thing that I want to get in your head too, is that it is possible. We argue a lot and say that there's no real way that we could get to these renewable sources of energy. It's too expensive, it's impossible, it'd just be too hard to rearrange our infrastructure. And don't get me wrong, in the United States it would be incredibly hard to rearrange the way that we do things in our infrastructure to allow this, but it is possible. Costa Rica, for instance, now Costa Rica is sort of an environmental leader anyway. They've got large areas of their rainforest that are protected, because they sort of focus on the ecotourism thing. But they get about 95% of their electricity from renewable sources. And that's really just an amazing statistic. And obviously a much smaller country, hard to scale those things to, say, the United States. But to give an example of that, China is actually planning right now to have, in just 6 years from now, to be about 15% renewable energy resource. Now, don't get me wrong, China obviously pollutes a lot and uses a lot of coal and all those things as well. But their goal is to be very renewable, 33%, a third of their energy by 2050, to be renewable resources. And we're talking about a country that's vastly bigger than the United States. So if we think about this in terms of us in the United States, this is possible, it is doable, and there are examples out there of how it could be done. So, I mean, why don't we then use more renewable now? Well, a big part of it is that we've got subsidies and tax breaks that favor fossil fuels. And so if we've got subsidies and tax breaks that favor fossil fuels, obviously those are going to be much less cost than renewable resources. There are subsidies for renewables typically, but they're much lower, and they have to be renewed every few years. I mean, it's basically sort of set in stone almost that the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry, is subsidized and supported. I mean, we fight wars partially on behalf of the oil industry. So the renewable resources, there are subsidies for them, but they're sort of under this constant renewal process, and when they get unpopular, they just don't get renewed, and so you don't get those subsidies. We're kind of in an era right now where that's kind of tough to do, even though the president might support those things. A lot of people in Congress don't, and sometimes for good reasons. You look at a collapse like Solyndra, and you think, well, obviously that money was given to a bad idea. And it's not necessarily that the idea was bad, but perhaps that the corporation itself that was doing it wasn't doing it very efficiently. And then, one of the big things is that the prices for renewables, for the fossil fuels and coal and oil and those things, they don't include the environmental costs. I mean, when we talk about the cost of oil and filling up our car, we don't consider the air pollution. We don't consider the mining of the coal in our electricity bill. None of that really we have to pay as consumers. And so since we don't really directly see those costs, we don't really see the impetus then to switch. And so that's why we don't switch to renewable resources now. So I want to focus a little bit specifically on solar heating for this particular video. So I want to talk about a couple of different things. One of the big ways that we can use solar for is just in heating. We spend a large amount of our money in either heating or cooling our homes. Of course, we're in the South, so we tend to spend a lot of it on cooling. But particularly as you get up north, you have to have heating or you're not going to be able to survive during the winters. And we can do a lot actively just with solar heating. I'm not even talking about generating electricity through solar sources, which we'll get to in a second, but just by heating a house and helping to keep a house cool. And so the idea behind passive solar heating is just that if you arrange the house in the right way, okay, if you're facing the sun in the right direction, now this is what makes it hard. You can't really retrofit a house for passive solar heating. But if you build them initially in the correct ways, so that the summer sun is coming in, but you've got it essentially blocked off by having longer eaves on your house that you basically extend the roof out a little ways. And then when the winter sun comes and the winter sun is at a different angle, it's low enough that it can actually make it in the house, so it's still heating it up. But during the summer, it's blocked out, so you don't need as much heat there. And then what they don't show in this diagram is that you typically in these cases, you've got these big vents up here that are going to allow the hot air to easily escape. Usually there's really big windows. You notice that these windows here are pretty huge so that you can allow breezes through. And I put a real-world example of this. This is actually an example in Hollywood, but these are popping up all over the place. These are green buildings, and they really specialize in this passive solar heating. You see that they can open up the windows. They can actually close them off in different areas, so you can shut them so that the heat isn't getting in if it's hot. In certain instances, or you could open them up to allow the breezes through. You can't really see it here, but it's kind of recessed, so you've got an outer area here, and so the sun can't come in because there's still roof or ceiling there that's blocking it off, so it can't come in, but you can still allow the breezes through. All of that would be passive solar heating. We can also have active solar heating as well. That's what we have down here on the bottom, and this is basically that you've got hot water panels on the top, and the sun is going to heat up those fluid-filled containers. Those are going to be basically pumped back down to the hot water heater. These aren't actually the water that's coming out, but they're going to be used to heat up the water then that you're going to use in your shower, in your bath, or dishwasher, or whatever. And essentially, you're getting that for free. You're not wasting electricity heating that stuff up that the sun is heating it up. Okay, and so that's more of an active situation as opposed to the passive situation where you're not really actively doing anything or you don't have a solar panel or anything like that up. Now, of course, we can also generate electricity from solar power. We can have solar power where it's used in the same way as our non-renewable resources, that solar power is used to heat up water. That water is heated so that it generates steam, and that's going to drive turbines. And there are a whole bunch of different ways that this can happen. This is basically a solar power tower. It's kind of hard to see here, but right in the middle here, right in the middle here, there's actually a tower right there, and all of these mirrors are focused on this tower, and they're basically focusing all of the heat from the sun back on that tower. That's going to heat up some water. That water is going to be used to drive a turbine, generate electricity. These parabolic ones and these flat ones here, you'll see the same sort of deal is happening, except that it's not being focused in one area, that they're going to heat up water or some sort of fluid. It's actually usually not water, but there's a fluid in there, and that fluid is going to get piped back in. That's going to be used to heat up water. The water is going to turn into steam. That's going to drive the turbines. In some cases, they even use some solids like salt and melt those down and allow that heat to generate the steam that's going to create that's going to push the turbine. And that's sort of the solar power. The sunlight isn't directly being turned into electricity, but it's being used to generate electricity much in the same way as, say, a fossil fuel plant, except, of course, that you're not burning anything to do it, so you've essentially got no emissions coming out of that. Now, what we often think of when we think about solar power is we think of photovoltaic cells. The idea behind that is that basically the sunlight comes in, it's going to excite electrons. Those electrons are then going to flow, and that flow of electrons, that is what electricity is. Now, these tend to be much more expensive, and although that price is dropping rapidly. And what's really cool now is they've even got it where they've got these little bendy strips of solar power so you can apply them in different places. But that's going to directly generate electricity, and as you get more and more and more of them, that generates more and more electricity, obviously, and you can get a lot of electricity out of that. You see here that these panels here, these are pretty cool panels, and you'll notice what they do in most modern solar plants is that they're on these swivels. And they're basically computer controlled so that they're going to follow the sunlight. So as the sun moves in the course of the day, these solar panels are going to move and shift to optimize the position so that they're constantly sort of getting the maximum amount of power so that they can generate as much power as possible. So, I mean, what are the advantages here? Well, the advantage, I mean, it's a moderate energy yield. We're not talking the same sort of yield that you would get from, say, burning a fuel, but it's a pretty good yield still. And of course, the biggie here is that there's basically no emissions from this. You're not generating CO2. You're not generating any sulfur dioxide. There's no nitrous gases going into the atmosphere. There's no carbon monoxide. It's essentially almost a perfectly clean energy source. Now, I will say, when I say that, there's a cost environmentally in the production of the solar energy panels. So where do they get the semiconductors? Where do they get the metals that go into making that? And are those being mined sustainably? That matters too. So always take into account this hidden cost. That's a big deal for us, right? What are the hidden costs of these things? Really, they're relatively easy to install and move. The cost is getting a lot more competitive. One of the reasons why back 20 years ago we wouldn't really go into this is because they were so expensive. You know, I want to put a solar system on my house, it's $30,000. Well, now you can do that for a few $1,000s, and particularly as there get to be some more government subsidies for that stuff, then you're able to do that more on a house-to-house basis and on a big basis like those big plants, the solar tower plants that we were looking at there. So what are the disadvantages? So pretty big ones. And again, this sort of blocks why you would use this in certain areas. I mean, you have to have access to the sun. And so if you're in an area that you're not getting a lot of sunlight, then that obviously is going to create a little bit of a problem. If you spend, 3/4 of your days under cloud cover, although you can still generate solar energy then, but not as much obviously, then that maybe makes that system a little bit less useful to you. One of the big ones, and we'll see this in the other ones, is that you have to have some sort of storage or backup system. Okay, what do you do when the sun goes down at night? Does that mean you just don't get any power? No, you can have some way to store that. So does that mean you have vast arrays of batteries, like chemical batteries there? And obviously there's some environmental issues there as well. What happens if the batteries fail? I mean, what happens in those cases? So there has to be some sort of backup system. We'll see in the next video when we talk about hydrogen and fuel cells. One of the big ideas is to combine hydrogen fuel cells with something like solar energy or even wind energy that we'll talk about in the next unit, and have them generate the hydrogen that's then used to burn in the fuel cells, because you have to generate the hydrogen first. And so maybe you could do that, and that would be your backup. That would basically keep it going all the time. It's relatively high cost, although that is decreasing. And the idea is like, well, why don't we just say coat Nevada or New Mexico with solar systems? And there are quite a few big ones there. But remember that deserts there are ecosystems there as well. There's biodiversity there as well. So we don't want to disrupt that too greatly. We tend to think of like, oh, well, there's nothing out in the desert, but there are organisms there. And of course, these solar systems are going to disrupt those and are going to change those. They might change them in better ways. Maybe they're going to create niches for the creatures to live underneath the solar panels because it's a cooler environment. That could happen as well. But the idea is that you're disrupting what was there in the first place. And so that's a little bit of a